Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Unit 7, Day 5. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about labor unions and strikes, but first we're going to start off with reviewing yesterday's notes, or Day 4 notes, I should say. And we're going to talk about Edward Bellamy, Karl Marx, and Henry George. Now, I'd just like for you to talk about how they proposed to fix the economy, specifically resolving the issues of monopolies, and how they had developed in the late 1800s. Just what were some of the ideas they were proposing? Obviously, we didn't talk about how they specifically addressed monopolies as a whole, but they did speak to some of the issues in our economy and how they could be fixed. The other thing is I'd like you to talk about is what are some ways that they tried to help push these reforms into period. So what were some things they accomplished? This entire journal should work together, and remember, as always, 4 to 5 sentences for your journal. Now, we're going to start talking about labor unions striking back. And I've got that play on words there because labor unions are going to use pretty much any means necessary to try to get their way for the workers that they represent. Now, our essential questions for today are how did labor unions influence the industrial age? And then also, what strategies are these labor unions using to promote their workers' rights? And there's a lot of various strategies, but we're going to start off with labor unions. So beginning with just a general overview of labor unions, they were mostly focused on construction and textiles. That was kind of the two areas where it started. And it just started as a organization to help members. They weren't trying to force companies to do anything. They weren't trying to organize strikes. They weren't trying to do any of that. They were just trying to help employees have a channel to get help. Now, the problem is that very quickly it becomes a channel to demand things from the employer for the worker, such as shorter work days, better wages, better conditions. One of the first groups that we'll talk about are the Knights of Labor, and they formed in Pennsylvania in 1869, and they were looking to try and organize virtually all men and women into one union. So for the entire country, there would be one union. This union then operated almost as a monopoly for unions, which is kind of ironic. They were looking for an 8-hour workday, equal pay for equal work, and trying to end child labor. So obviously you can see that child labor is not just accepted. It's not like people are just walking around saying, it's okay that we're putting our children in these very dangerous situations. It wasn't. However, they also are fighting against very big corporations with a lot of money, and you're in a time period where this is all new. It's not like today where we've had factories for 150 years. They've been around for 15, 20 years in some places. Now, obviously, in some of these bigger cities, we've had factories as early as the early 1800s, but they're still trying to develop where does the government's role in industry kind of fall. And now we kind of know, but at that time we really didn't. So, they also actively recruited African Americans with over 60,000 members. In 1885, a union affiliated with the Knights forced Jay Gould to give a wage cut, and membership soared to over 700,000. So you can see that there are a lot of people that are looking for help during this time. Now, one of the ways that employers tried to strike back was they would have these what they called yellow dog contracts. And essentially what this did is it made a worker promise that they would never join a union or a strike. Now, in 1877, we see one of our first major strikes. And guys, we could probably spend 2 weeks talking about all the various strikes that went on during this time period because they're all over and they pop up all over. But in the summer of 1877, a Baltimore and Ohio railroad announced that they were going to be given a 10% wage cut, which was going to be the second wage cut that they had done in less than 8 months. As you can imagine, the workers there are outraged, and they're going to actually become violent, so violent, in fact, that they're forced to call in the militia. And because of the hostility between the two groups, the militia ends up firing on the demonstrators. The president hears about this. He's forced to send in federal troops now to try and stop the riots. But unfortunately, he causes more death. Now, the important part of this is not so much the strike, whether it was successful, whether the workers got what they wanted. What's important about this strike specifically is that this sets a precedent for the future. You're going to now have this belief among other businesses that, hey, if our workers start striking, we can't handle it. The president's just going to send in federal troops and take care of it for us and quell the strike. And unfortunately, it's a very dangerous precedent to set. Now, one of the other groups that we'll talk about is the American Federation of Labor. And we talked about the Knights of Labor first. Now we come to the American Federation of Labor. And they were a little bit different. They weren't trying to put everyone into one union. They just wanted to organize workers into a smaller union that was devoted to a specific craft. Okay, maybe a blacksmith, or maybe you're just a general construction worker or something of that nature. By 1892, they still only represent a small portion of America's workforce, so they did not grow exponentially all at once. However, it's still a group that is advocating for workers' rights and advocating for changes in these work days and things of that nature, things that we don't even think about, guys. I mean, we'll be in unit 9 or 10 before we really get to where workers are getting the rights that these labor unions were trying to fight for, or that just the government regulations are in place like they are, or like they should have been in this time period. Now, in 1886, the McCormick Harvest Company was dealing with a strike from its workers who were calling for 8-hour work days, 8 hours to sleep, and 8 hours to do with what they would. And what really upsets the strikers is that they bring in what they call scabs. And they basically were strike breakers. All right, so they come in and work and replace the workers temporarily in order to convince these men who were striking to come back to their jobs. Well, the strike goes on for a period of time, gets kind of violent. There's an issue where the cops are forced to shoot someone on May 3rd, or I can't remember if they shot someone on May 3rd or they're just 4 protesters died, but 4 protesters die on May 3rd. And then on May 4th, a bomb is thrown into, it's like I would say it was a Molotov cocktail, I want to say. But it's thrown into this group of police, and the police start shooting. And as a result of the bomb and the shooting, 7 policemen die and 4 more protesters. So it's a violent strike, guys. This is something that if it was in today's news, people would be blowing up social media over. As a result of the strike, 8 were charged, 4 anarchists were hung, and another committed suicide in jail. The other 3, I believe 2 were acquitted, and I would have to look up what happened to the last of the 8. But it shows here that this is a very bad situation for not only the company, but also for the workers, how just controversial this issue is of these companies being expected to give them rights. In today's society, we think of that as just natural. Now, one of the next strikes that we'll talk about is the Homestead strike, and this takes place at one of Andrew Carnegie's steel mills. And during this time, Andrew Carnegie is overseas, and he has left a man by the name of Henry Frick in charge. Henry Frick was brought in to maximize profits and kind of organize the company to be more efficient. The problem is he has this very, hard way of looking at things and these very hard business practices where he's trying to cut wages and he's trying to maximize efficiency, but he's doing it in a way that he has no care for the people that are working there. As a result of this, Henry Frick tries to cut wages, and the people in the Pennsylvania factory, they are ticked. And so they start striking, and they refuse to let anybody in. They won't even let the scabs or the strike breakers in to get in there to complete work. They are blocking the business or the company. So Frick is forced to call in the Pinkertons. And when the Pinkertons come in, they were this private police force, and they were known for breaking strikes, but they were also known for protecting the president at one point. They've been involved all over. When they're brought in, there's something happens to where something gets thrown or shot at. I want to say thrown by the strikers, and then a gun goes off from one of the Pinkertons, and before you know it, the Pinkertons are firing on the strikers. And as a result, the strike is put down, but it's this black mark on Carnegie for a long time from this Homestead riot and what happens with the strike workers. Now, with that said, Carnegie Steel, which will eventually become U.S. Steel when J.P. Morgan, we haven't talked a lot about Morgan yet, but J.P. Morgan's going to purchase the company in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he's going to change the name to U.S. Steel. But even then, it will not be unionized until the 1930s. So, it took almost 38 years for them to eventually be unionized. Um, and guys, it's important to note about these unions and strikes and all these rights that they're fighting for. There's no government regulation. These unions are basically serving the place of what the government will eventually step in and play. And there are still labor unions today, but they operate a lot differently. And honestly, most companies that you work for give you more rights and more freedom as an individual than what a union would be. You're actually somewhat more restricted sometimes, but from a union, because the union has to negotiate on your part. All right, the next strike we're going to talk about is the Pullman strike, and this takes place 2 years after Homestead. It was the last of the real great strikes of this age. And George Pullman, who was a sleeping train car maker, and I've got a picture there on the right, you can see the kind of cars that they made. They're very beautiful. He had built this entire town near Chicago for his workers. They had a school, bank, water, gas systems. I mean, they had the whole works. And unfortunately, a depression in 1893 had forced Pullman to cut wages by almost 40% at its highest peak. And I mean, you can imagine, man's running a town, trying to run a business, and the depression forces him to basically, instead of laying off workers, just cut their wages. Because he needs the workers, but he can't pay them what he was paying them. And the American Railway Union called for the strike, said that, hey, we need to go against, what he's doing here. This isn't fair. He shouldn't be allowed to cut our wages almost half for the same amount of work. And Pullman is forced to shut down the plant. The problem here is that by shutting down the plant, it's going to lead to some bigger issues as a nation. Now, Eugene Debs was also a labor organizer from Indiana who got involved in the railroad strike at this time. And he recruited workers to strike. So he would actually go to these workers who were working the railroad company and try to convince them that they needed to strike in other railroads, and tried to shut down the railroads from across the nation. And eventually, the United States government realized this is a problem because they needed the trains to carry their mail. It was disrupting the U.S. mail service. And so President Grover Cleveland is forced to send in federal troops, uses a court order and says that the strikes cannot affect railroad travel, that the strike can't block trains from moving because they need the mail system to function. Eugene Debs is also arrested, and eventually I think he'll be released. I'd have to go look that up for you. But Debs is arrested. Eventually, I believe he's acquitted of what he is accused of, because he wasn't trying to block the mail system. He was just trying to help, workers. But the problem and the bigger issue here is that it sets a precedent that essentially a factory, if they are dealing with strikes, and they want it to stop, they can apply for a court order, and the government can basically order that strike be disbanded, and the workers either go back or they're fired. So just a very interesting situation here for our country or society and what's going on in our economy. It's just a very, very, I won't say diversity or adverse. It's a very just rough time to be a worker. Let's just put it that way. And for most employees, they're not getting a very good deal when it comes to their workday, their pay, situation, conditions, etc. So here's your vocabulary words. Make sure you get all 4 of these down, and please let me know if you have any further issues.